The courtroom in New Bedford felt hot enough to melt reason. On June 5th of 1893, crowds packed themselves shoulder to shoulder just for the chance to see Lizzie Andrew Borden walk through a doorway. Newspapers had already turned her into the most infamous woman in America. By then, people knew the rhyme by heart. They whispered it in parlors and repeated it on sidewalks and passed it around like a tune nobody could quite get out of their head. Lizzie Borden took an axe. The country had already convicted her long before the trial ever even started. And yet, the deeper you dig into the story, the stranger the whole thing becomes. How well do you know the story of Lizzie Borden? Because this was never really a clean case. It was a case that was soaked in contradictions and strange behavior and family tension and bad police work and details so unsettling that even now, more than a century later, people still argue over what truly happened inside of the house on 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts. It was soaked in intrigue, not blood. The Borden house itself almost feels important to the story. Not because it was grand or elegant. In fact, it wasn't. It was one of the things that surprises people. The house still stands and you can go and tour it. Andrew Borden was rich. He was extremely rich for the time. By modern standards, his fortune would have been worth many millions of dollars. He owned property and held important business positions. He controlled land and buildings and investments across the entire city of Fall River. But despite all of that money, the family lived in a narrow and plain house with no indoor plumbing. There were no luxurious estate for them. They didn't live on a hill. There was no sprawling mansion. It was just a cramped and uncomfortable home sitting close to downtown Fall River. People noticed that, even back then. The wealthy families of Fall River usually lived farther away in an area called the Highlands, where large homes kind of overlooked the cleaner streets and the quieter neighborhoods. But Andrew Borden, well, he stayed where he was. Some people called him careful. Others called him cheap or a penny pincher or a miser. Either way, tension lived in that house long before the murders ever took place. Lizzie herself remains difficult to pin down even now. She taught Sunday school. She attended church faithfully. She worked with religious organizations and local charities. By many accounts, she seemed quite polite and reserved and intelligent and very proper. But people also described her as distant, quiet in a way that made others uncertain to what she was thinking. And then there was her name, Lizzie Andrew Borden. The middle name always catches people a little off guard. Andrew named his daughter after himself, which feels oddly revealing once you know more about the family dynamic. Everything in the house seemed to orbit around him. It was his money. It was his decisions. It was his rules. And in 1892, I suppose this was to be expected. The man was the head of the household, right? A lot of families still live that way even now. But daughters' identities seem tied directly back to their father. After Lizzie's mother died, Andrew remarried a woman named Abby. So the relationship between Abby and the daughters appears to have remained kind of strained for years. Lizzie loved her mother dearly, and she reportedly refused to call this woman mother, instead referred to her formally as Mrs. Borden. That's pretty formal, especially for a woman who's living in your house, is it not? It would probably put a little bit of a strain on the relationship. That detail alone says a great deal. So then came the arguments over property. Andrew gave real estate to Abby's relatives. Lizzie and her sister Emma became upset enough that they demanded property of their own. There were disputes over houses. There was disputes over money and inheritance, and even over ownership of certain places. Family resentment thickened like a stew, slowly, like smoke trapped in a closed room. And then strange things began happening before the murders. The entire household became violently ill only days earlier. Someone suspected spoiled food. This was also fairly common in 1892. Others whispered about poison, maybe. Abby herself reportedly feared someone might be trying to kill the entire family. Even the girls, Lizzie and her sister, were sick. But then there was the matter of the pigeons. Andrew killed several pigeons in the barn with a hatchet after worrying that they carried some kind of disease. According to some accounts, Lizzie had recently built a place for the birds and was deeply upset by this action afterward. I would be too. She built a home for what she wanted to think of as her pets, I suppose. Whether that detail mattered or not, nobody really knows, but she was really upset about it. In hindsight, every strange family argument suddenly looks sinister, though. So we have to take this as it was in the moment. But then came August 4th of 1892. It was a humid Thursday morning. It was the sort of morning where ordinary routines later become kind of unbearable to remember. The people ate breakfast and spoke casually and walked through rooms without realizing they were walking through the final ordinary hours of their lives. Abby went upstairs to make up the guest room. At some point between roughly 9 and 10:30 in the morning, someone attacked her with a hatchet. I say someone for very good reason. The violence was horrifying, absolutely horrific. The first blow struck her near the ear in the back. She fell forward. Then came blow after blow after blow to the back of her head. 17 more strikes. Think about that for just a moment. Not one desperate swing. There was no panic. This was not an accident. This was either fury or terror, or both. Meanwhile, Andrew left the house for his morning errands. When he returned home around 10:30, something odd happened immediately. His key would not work in the door. The maid, Bridget Sullivan, struggled to open it from the inside because the lock was jammed. And while she fought with the door, she later testified that she heard Lizzie laughing somewhere upstairs. That seems kind of sinister and a little out of place here. That tiny detail seems really odd. Mainly because Abby was already dead by then, and she was upstairs. Eventually, Andrew entered the home, removing his boots, and settled onto the sitting room sofa. And he closed his eyes for a brief nap. Sometime after 11 o'clock, someone approached him while he rested, and the first strike split one of his eyes in half. Doctors later believed that he may have been asleep when the attack began, so this makes it even more brutal. More blows followed, and when it ended, Andrew Borden was nearly unrecognizable. But here's where the story begins twisting in every direction at once, because almost immediately, Lizzie's statements started changing, and that never looks good for anyone. At first, she claimed that she heard strange noises before entering the room. Later, she said that she heard nothing at all. She claimed Abby had gone out after receiving a note about a sick friend, but no note was ever found. Then she said she had been in the barn eating pears and searching for fishing sinkers during the time of that first murder. And people have argued about that barn story ever since. The maid, Bridget Sullivan, became another major figure in this investigation. She had spent the morning washing windows outside in the brutal heat, and eventually she went upstairs to rest in her attic room. Then she heard Lizzie shouting from below. She yelled out, "Maggie, come quick, father's dead." By then, the household had become a complete nightmare. Police arrived, of course, rather quickly. And this is where modern investigators start kind of grinding their teeth over this case. Because the police work was astonishingly sloppy. Of course, there wasn't much in the way of investigations, and there was basically no forensics in 1892. But officers admitted later on that they could not conduct a thorough search at first because Lizzie seemed calm and respectable. How does that have to do with them not being able to conduct a search? So they failed to properly inspect her for bloodstains. They did not secure everything immediately, and inside the basement, they discovered several tools, including axes and hatchets, and a broken hatchet handle that looked suspiciously freshly broken. One officer believed the dust on the hatchet head looked deliberately applied, almost as though someone had tried to make it appear old and forgotten, like they had tried to put the dust on it. That seems a little odd, but confusion surrounded nearly every piece of evidence that they found. Nothing was clean and nothing was definitive. But then came another really weird moment. A friend named Alice Russell later testified that she saw Lizzie burning a dress in the kitchen stove days after the murders. Well, according to Russell, Lizzie claimed the dress had old paint stains on it. Well, that seems odd, and people nearly exploded over that detail. Why burning clothes immediately after a double axe murder? Why do this? This seems like a really odd thing to do. But did you see it at all? By then, this poem was already getting around. People were already talking about this. So the defense never truly managed to erase the suspicion surrounding that moment and this testimony. And yet, even then, there still remains a massive problem for prosecutors. There was no direct proof. There was no witness. There's no bloody clothing that was ever recovered. There was no murder weapon conclusively identified. And perhaps the strangest of all, no obvious signs that Lizzie herself had just committed one of the bloodiest crimes in American history. That has always bothered people. It's always bothered me. The murders were incredibly violent. Anyone committing them should have been absolutely drenched in head to toe with blood, not just a dress. So where did it go? Then, just as the country prepared for the trial, something happened that almost nobody remembers today. Another axe murder occurred in Fall River. That's right, you never hear about this one. 5 days before Lizzie's trial began, a woman named Bertha Manchester was hacked to death in her kitchen under circumstances disturbingly similar enough that jurors themselves reportedly noticed the similarities. Think about that timing. 5 days before the trial, the entire country believed Fall River housed one savage axe killer. Then another axe killing suddenly erupted right before the trial of the person that they thought was the axe killer. A man was later convicted for the Manchester murder, but investigators determined he likely had nothing to do with the Borden case. Still, the coincidence rattled people in Fall River because suddenly the possibility emerged that perhaps Fall River's violence was larger and stranger than anyone thought. Then came the trial itself. Crowds mobbed the courthouse every single day. Newspapers covered every moment Lizzie made. Reporters described her expressions, her clothing, her posture, and her reactions with absolutely obsessive detail. At one point, prosecutors included the skulls of Andrew and Abby Borden in the courtroom as evidence. They had stripped away the flesh from the bone. They wouldn't even let them rest. They had to have them in court as a piece of evidence that was really just spectacularly bad taste. Lizzie fainted when she saw them. And honestly, most people probably would have. This was her father and her stepmother that she really didn't seem to get along with, but her father. The prosecution tried hard to build a picture of guilt through contradictions and suspicious behavior, but the defense fought back quite effectively. They challenged the timelines that were set forth. They pointed out the weak investigation and attacked the assumptions of the people around them. And perhaps most importantly, they reminded the jurors again and again and again that suspicion alone does not equal proof. One particularly important moment involved poison. Witnesses claimed that Lizzie had attempted to buy hydrocyanic acid shortly before the murders. But the judge excluded that evidence from the trial. Another major issue involved Lizzie's inquest testimony, which has been erratic and contradictory. If you ever get a chance to read it, definitely do. She had been given morphine at the time to calm her nerves, and her answers wandered badly. It's a bad idea if you want somebody to sit on the stand to give them morphine or really any sedative drug. That testimony also became inadmissible during the trial. Of course it did. One by one, pieces of the prosecution weakened. And then came the jury's deliberation. It lasted only about 90 minutes. And I know that sounds really fast, but in the 1890s, juries were pushed to get the verdicts out quickly. But that 90 minutes, that was all it took. And nearly a year of public hysteria and endless newspaper coverage and nationwide fascination, the jury returned with a verdict of not guilty. Lizzie Borden walked free and immediately became one of the most famous women in America. But acquittal did not bring peace to this woman. Not even close. Fall River never fully forgave her. People whispered constantly, and that poem continued to circulate. She was stared at when she passed people. Repeatedly, she heard that poem chanted at her. That must have been awful. Whether she did or whether she didn't, especially if she didn't, can you imagine the weight of that? She and Emma moved into a larger home that they named Maplecroft, but the shadow of the murders followed them there, too. Of course it did. Fall River was a small place. And over the time, the sisters themselves drifted apart. Emma eventually moved away entirely after some kind of disagreement that has never fully been explained. The mystery only deepened with age because the theories kept multiplying. Some believed that Lizzie acted alone. Others suspected Bridget Sullivan, the maid. Some pointed at the uncle, John Morse, whose alibi felt strangely polished and kind of unbelievable. Others believed years of hidden family trauma may have existed beneath the surface of the household. And if you look into it, there's a lot there. And still others insisted the wrong person had been blamed from the very beginning. No theory has ever fully solved every problem. That's why this case still survives. Because unlike many famous crimes, this one just never closed neatly. There's always another contradiction waiting in the corner, another timeline issue, another unanswered question, another strange little detail, like the fact that Lizzie inherited substantial wealth after the deaths, or the fact that she later donated generously to animal rescue efforts. Would a girl who was only worried about money donate her money? Or the fact that despite being one of the most famous women in America, she died quietly in 1927 during the Great Depression from pneumonia, while still carrying the weight of accusations that never went away and never left her alone. And perhaps the strangest thing of all is how the public transformed real murders into folklore. Children skipped rope while chanting about 40 whacks. Oh, grim. Newspapers sensationalized every rumor about this woman. Books, plays, films, television series, all of this stuff followed for generations afterward, and nobody got it right. The actual evidence became tangled together with myth until separating one from the other became nearly impossible. All it takes is one person that spreads the myth to somewhere like a newspaper, and the newspaper taking that myth and spreading it, and suddenly you have 10 sources that say the same thing, and that seems like a pretty credible source, doesn't it? Maybe that's the true reason why Lizzie Borden still fascinates people. Not because we're certain that she did it, but because we're not. The uncertainty unsettles us. People like certainty. They want villains clearly labeled and endings fully explained. This case refuses to cooperate in that way. Maybe Lizzie Borden murdered her father and her stepmother in broad daylight and somehow concealed every trace of it. Maybe someone else walked through the house while suspicion settled permanently on the wrong young lady. Or maybe the truth was so tangled in family resentment and fear and secrecy and panic that nobody alive ever fully understood what happened on the inside. Possibility lingers, and it keeps the story alive. So here's the question for you today. If you had sat on that jury in 1893 and heard only the evidence presented in court, do you believe you honestly could have voted to convict Lizzie Borden beyond a reasonable doubt? Or do you think you would have let her walk free? And of course, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get podcasts so that you never miss a strange and bizarre and random history episode. Every subscriber helps, every review helps, every comment, every like, every share, all that stuff helps other people to see what it is that I do and keeps me doing what it is that I do. Thank you for watching.